Thank you, Mr. Delige. That's it for that song. I almost got up and sang with you better. I was, yeah, I wasn't sure. But it's been a second since I last saw you. Between the last time I saw you and today, it's just been handling assignments and exams. So it's nice to finally complete and finish from New Build. But it's still funny when I hear people say, Pastor Lawrence. I'm still not used to that. As you can see, I still carry my exercise books and my backpack wherever I go. I still take the trains everywhere. I'm still living the student life, still learning about God, still getting to know about God, and aren't we all really, right? And I think that's the right attitude when it comes to the mission of God. You're never fully finished, are you? We're never fully done, are we? Yes, and so even though New Build has said I've finished, and then for me the journey is just beginning in learning about God and getting to know God. And in fact, last week I wasn't at my best health-wise, and so you'd be surprised I tuned in at Folkestone Church to listen to Elder Violet talk about mental health, right? And it takes everything. And today's message is really just taking us back to where it all begins, in relationships, in knowing God, understanding what God is all about. And so I know Oleg read Genesis 12, 1-3, but really we're going to read a lot more than that today, because we're going to go straight to the Bible, to the text, and to try and pick out what it means to be in a relationship with God. And so if you can get your Bibles ready, because we're going to be reading a lot from there today. And I'm hoping everything will make sense and you'll be able to understand. And because of that, it will be useful to pray just one more time so that the Spirit of God will lead us through it. Lord God, we're about to open your word. Our eyes has been blurred and we need you to open it so that we can understand and see more of what you have for us this Sabbath day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Yes. So let's turn to Genesis chapter 12, 10-20. Although Oleg read Genesis 12, 1-3, the reason for that is because much of what we will talk about today is hinged or pinned on those verses Oleg read today. As one Professor Lawrence Turner puts it, much of what happens in the book of Genesis regarding Abraham and his family is underpinned by those verses in Genesis 12, 1-3. So let's turn to Genesis 12, 10-20. That's where we first find a very interesting passage of, well, you can call it traveling, you can call it emigrating, you can call it immigrating. We're going to find the first story there from Genesis 12, 10-20. And I chose to translate it from the Hebrew text. And so I'm going to read it from my exercise book. You can follow along in whatever version you have. Is that okay? So it says, and there was hunger which descended on the land. And Abraham sojourned in the land of Egypt because of the heavy hunger or famine in the land. And upon arrival to Egypt, Abraham said to Sarai, his wife, look, I know that you are beautiful. You are a beautiful woman, or you are nice in appearance. And so when it occurs that the Egyptians look at you and think this is his wife, they will kill me and keep you alive. So please say to them that you are my sister, so that it may be well with me on account of you, and my soul may be alive on account of you. And it came to pass, as soon as he came towards Egypt, that the Egyptians looked at his wife, and indeed she was very beautiful. And the princess of Pharaoh also saw her too, and praised her for her beauty, and took her to Pharaoh's house. And Abram was treated very well because of Sarai. And he got sheep, he got cattle, he got donkeys, he got servants, he got maidservants, and jennies and camels. He was given everything he needed, on top of everything he brought into Egypt. And the Lord struck Pharaoh with great plagues, and his household became because of Sarai. the wife of Abram. And Pharaoh called to Abram and said to him, "What is this that you have made me do? Why did you not report to me that she's your wife? Why did you say to me she's your sister? And I took her for my wife. And now look, take your wife and go." And Pharaoh ordered his men to send out Sarah and all of Abraham's household. So we find the first passage of what I want to talk to you about in Genesis chapter 12, 10 to 20. Before I proceed though, let us read something similar, okay? From Genesis 20. So we're going to go to Genesis 20 now, from verse 1, and we're going to read a very similar story, but with slight changes. So Genesis 20 verse 1, it says, "And Abraham," so he's now Abraham, "he set out from there towards the land to the south desert, and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said to Sarah," now her name is Sarah, his wife, "that again, Sarah is my sister." And the king of Gerar, Abimelech, took Sarah. God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman which you have taken, and she is married with a husband." And Abimelech did not come near toward her and said to the Lord, "Isn't my people guiltless to be killed? Didn't he say to me, 'She is my sister'? And even she, Sarah, said, 'He is my brother.' I have a heart of integrity, Lord, and my hands are clean. I will deal with this." And God, coming towards him in a dream, said, "I know that you, Abimelech, are innocent. Your heart is full of integrity. So you deal with this and refrain from this, and even I will withhold this guilt from you. So thus do not touch or put your hand on her. And now bring back Sarah, the wife of the man, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for your benefit, and you will live." This caused Abimelech to rise up early in the morning and cried out to all his servants and spoke all those words to their ears, and the people were so afraid. So afraid. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. Now, these passages I've actually come to appreciate as stories of the Old Testament, and particularly of the first 5 books of Moses. These stories I've come to appreciate because it communicates something very relevant. But you have to really read it and reread it to understand why these 2 stories are so similar and why there are some nuance or differences within the passages we just read from Genesis 12 and Genesis chapter 20. But let us go back to what Oleg read from Genesis 12, 1 to 3. Where it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who curses you. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed." 8 times, if you pay attention to that verse, God addresses Abraham and Abraham alone. Sarah isn't mentioned, no other name is mentioned. Do you notice that? In the blessing? All the blessing is for Abraham and his household. Full stop. 8 times his name is mentioned and his household. It's not an ordinary blessing, it's a special blessing that the Lord pronounced on one man, one individual, that all the earth will be blessed through him. And so, if you were Abraham, wouldn't you want to protect that blessing at any cost? If the Lord came to you and said, "I've blessed you," and mentions your name 8 times, wouldn't you want to protect that blessing wherever you go? And so Abraham finds himself in a situation where there is a famine in the land. This famine is so bad it can cause death. And he says, okay, we need to leave the promised land of Canaan, to a different place. And so he takes his wife, he takes everything he has, and they head to the land of Egypt. We know later in the histories, Egypt becomes the focal point again. That saves lives, isn't it? When Joseph becomes prime minister in that place. And so there's a common theme with Egypt being a place that saves lives, a place that people go to for refuge. And Abraham and his wife heads to this place. Now, one theologian, Wenham, talks about Canaan being very hilly. Lots of mountains, it's very prone to getting dry. Whereas Egypt was on a plain where it got nourishment and it could oftentimes have food and things people needed. And so Abraham goes towards this place. And he gets there and he thinks about himself. He says, Sarah, you're too nice, you're too good looking, and I don't want to die today. So please, let's lie about this situation. The man of God, that's the first thing he thinks about.
That's misconduct.
Misconduct?
Misleading.
Misleading. The man of God strategizes and says, okay, we need to do something about how good you look so that I can be saved in this place we're going to. He already makes an assumption that the Egyptians are too barbaric and that they will take his wife and kill him. And so let us strategize and lie for me. You're no longer my wife, but you are my sister. Have we heard similar stories before? We have. So let's not judge Abraham too harshly today. But let's proceed. They get to Egypt, and Abraham says, Sarah is not my wife, she's my sister. And they take her into Pharaoh's harem, that is his place where he holds all his women or his wives, so that he can be betrothed to Pharaoh. Sarah doesn't complain. She doesn't question Abraham, because as we know, it was a patriarchal society, wasn't it, back in the day? And women didn't really have much of a voice. The husband speaks and you remain silent. And this is pertinent here in the story. But what is interesting though, is that even though Sarah doesn't say anything, the text, when we read it, says that God plagued Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah the woman. So even though in a patriarchal society where women were not considered, talked about, or their voices were not heard, God's eyes were fixed on the woman as opposed to Abraham's mistakes. And he already had a plan to save this woman's dignity from being destroyed by Pharaoh. And so God strikes Pharaoh's household, the entire household, with plagues. And Pharaoh is confused. Talk about being disenfranchised. Talk about being confused and not knowing what's going on. Talk about your mental health spiraling out of control. He was confused. Why has this happened? And so he counted stock and said, okay, what has changed in my household? What have we done recently that's been different to anything else? It must be this woman. It must be Sarai. So let's talk to Abraham. And Abraham tries to defend himself as Adam defended himself in the garden. It's the woman you gave me. Abraham is saying, I was scared for my life. And Pharaoh says, take all your things and leave. What is interesting though, in the first text, we don't hear God talking to Pharaoh. God is not giving any instructions. He just plagues Egypt. He plagues everyone in the house. He doesn't blink an eye. He just does it. Because Sarah is his daughter. Sarah is no ordinary woman. Sarah is a child of God. That's the first thing. But Pharaoh doesn't have a relationship with God, because God doesn't go to Pharaoh to have a dialogue with him. He doesn't go to talk to him and tells him what he's done wrong. He just plagues his house. No questions asked. We go to the second text in Genesis chapter 20. And it's the same sort of story. We're not told why Abraham leaves or wants to go to a different land, Gerar, but we're told he picks up his things and leaves anyway. But now the promise of God includes Sarah. God says, I'm going to bless you through Sarah's womb. That's the difference. So the first time, the blessing in Genesis 12 doesn't include Sarai. But the second time, in Genesis 20, by the time we get there, God says, your wife Sarai is now Sarah. You, Abram, are now Abraham. the blessings includes you too. Sarah will birth a child for you. I'm going to bless you as a family. And the promised child will come through Sarah. But what is significantly amazing is that Abraham gets to a different border in Gerar, and he does the same thing. He lies twice and says, my wife is my sister. Even though God's promise includes Sarah, his wife. Twice he lies. That means it's not just a one-off, it must be a habit, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
2 times he lies. The promise includes your wife, he still lies, she's my sister. Another interesting thing is Sarah doesn't complain, but she actually complies. When we read the text, Sarah agrees that yes, he is my brother. And let's lie together, let's go through this experience together. But there is another interesting change. The king is also different. The king is King Abimelech. And King Abimelech does the same thing Pharaoh did in Egypt. He takes the right to be his wife, and but he doesn't touch her or do anything. He's just taken her, betrothed himself with her. But what is interesting is God approaches Abimelech in a dream, unlike with Pharaoh. So let's pay attention to the dialogue between God and Abimelech. God comes to Abimelech in a dream, verse 3 of Genesis 20, and says to him, behold, you are a dead man, because of the woman which you have taken, for she is married with a husband. So it starts with a conversation from God. God approaches him at night in a dream and says, look, you are about to do something very wrong. Why does God approach Abimelech and not Pharaoh? Why does God see the need to communicate with King Abimelech and not with Pharaoh of Egypt? Is there favoritism here? He knew God. But what is again significant, Abimelech doesn't hesitate. He also replies to God. He says, what does he say? Didn't he say to me, she is my sister? And even she said, he's my brother. I have a heart of integrity, and my hands are clean. I will deal with this. He's not startled at all, at least not at first. He recognizes the voice speaking to him, and he replies. Very interesting story. And so let us look at a few things that could have happened if God didn't intervene. First of all, Sarah's dignity would have been ruined. A man of God's wife ruined with another man. That would have been a bad look on the prophet, number 1. Sarah's dignity would have been ruined, number 2. And what's the third thing that could have happened? The promised child Isaac, we don't know what could have happened with that. Because a different man, a different woman, the promise of God may have been completely destroyed. And so while Abraham sought to protect the promise of God, as read by Oleg in Genesis 12, 1-3, his desire to protect it would have actually destroyed the entire blessing God wanted to bring upon his life, had he just simply told the truth initially, in both instances. And so, let us proceed. But before we proceed, let's just take a quick detour to a book that we hardly read from, in the book Songs of Solomon. I just want us to capture something there in the connection between marriage. So Songs of Solomon 7:11-12 says, come, my beloved, let us go forth into the fields and lodge into the villages. Let us go out early to the vineyards and see whether the vines have budded, whether the grape blossoms have opened, and the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my love. So, when we talk about having a relationship with God, those who have the best bond with Jesus Christ or with God are always people who don't have too much time on their hands. They are people who work very hard in their relationship to get to know God. As I said, coming from Newbold, thinking I've finished, but I still need to read more and more to get to know Jesus Christ. And we get that sense with King Abimelech in comparison with Pharaoh. Because God really sought to communicate with Abimelech and ask him and to inquire of him what he was doing, but to actually tell him that he was doing the wrong thing and he needs to put the brakes on and stop because he's about to sin against him. Whereas with Pharaoh, the judgment of God came swiftly to his whole household. And Pharaoh didn't know what was going on. He just had to send Abraham and his things away. With Abimelech, though, at the end of the story, if you look carefully, when God instructed him of what he was doing, he actually said to Abraham, look, don't go away. I have a land elsewhere. You can live there with your wife, with everything I gave to you, but I'm not going to do anything with your wife. You go with your wife to your space, but I've accepted you into where I am. You can live here. Whereas Pharaoh sent him away. He said, look, I can't deal with you. You need to leave this place. And so what that communicates within those verses is that when we have a relationship with God, we seek to have it with other people, despite whatever harm they may have initially wrought or brought onto us. And so these stories portray very similar things from the beginning, but the relationship that's established there is different, because one had a relationship with God, the other one did not have a relationship with God. The judgment of God came swiftly onto Pharaoh. The judgment of God took his time with Abimelech, because God wanted to have a dialogue with him, because they were already in good terms and a good relationship. And so we have this text I just read from King Solomon, which talks about the blossoms being open and the pomegranates blooming. Like I said, when we don't make the correlations between texts, at times we can read something and we think, what's the essence of this? King Solomon was referring to the love of his life. But when you go further to really try and deconstruct what he's trying to say, he says, in order for us to show our love, we do those things when the pomegranates are in bloom and the grape blossoms are open. When we go further into the New Testament, Jesus says something very similar. And as I was reading the text, I thought to myself, this kind of makes sense. Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are. What does that mean in the context of relationship? When we have a work to do, we do it out of our hearts, lovingly, when we care about the other person. Am I right? The same with the context Solomon is talking about with marriage. When we love someone, we do it when the pomegranates are in bloom and the grape blossoms have opened. We show it at our brightest. And it's the same with the relationship demonstrated with Abimelech and God. They had a very good relationship. And so when God came to him in a dream, he didn't hesitate. He answered clearly and said to God, look, I'm a man of integrity. Are you going to hurt me and my household? Pharaoh couldn't make the same claim because they had no relationship. It's a bit like when I was coming here yesterday and I went to work. I work in a school. And for the whole of yesterday, I just felt terrible. I didn't feel very good. And I was all of a sudden questioning myself. Why am I not feeling good? I've turned up to work. I'm ready to do the job, but I still don't feel good. And God had to remind me that actually, Lawrence, have you paid attention that whenever I send you to go do my work, you're not feeling very good? And I said, you make a point. He said, you better start praying more and get yourself ready to get to Folkestone, because there's much more going on than you can see. So get to know me, start praying a bit more, and I will take care of you. But don't focus on how you're feeling, just relate to me. Just come to me and I will help you. Don't rely on your intelligence or your preparation, because I will get you through it. And so I had to come to that realization, because at times we think, we're just going through something. Pharaoh thought, I'm going through something, but I don't know what it is, because he had no relationship with God. Abimelech said, I'm going through something. God, what is it? Why is this happening? And God could answer those questions because they were already in a relationship. They had constructed a loving relationship. And so, as Christians and as children of God, this is something we have to be wary of, because when we establish a good relationship with God, with our fellow Christian members, we make it very difficult for the devil and the adversary to get to us or to get close to us. I was watching a documentary from David Attenborough on penguins, and the penguins have a few predators. One of them is this massive bird that stands on the lookout, waiting for the penguin that will leave the fold. And he attacks that penguin that has left the fold. Now, what is interesting is when he does the documentary, you see when the penguins are together, the predator can't find any way to attack any of them. But as soon as one of them breaks away, it's able to aim and attack that penguin that has broken away. Relationships bind us to God, but it binds us with our fellow Christians as well. And it makes it very hard for the adversary to reach any of us because we are in constant communion with God, with each other. And we are constantly conversing and communicating God, edifying one another, and elevating our hearts to the God who has created us to be in relationship and in union with Him. Let us refer to one writer that we always talk about, Mrs. White, in her letters 46. And let us talk about Abraham. Let's focus on Abraham, for instance. It says, when I see men in positions of trust who are not considerate, I think of how different their course would be if they took Christ as their companion, to give them counsel, to guide them, to lead them in plain paths. Abraham was in a position of trust, yes? And he still lied twice and still broke that rule from God. He still lied to protect himself and the promise of God. And we saw the consequences that could have resulted had God not intervened. When we are in position of trust, and usually that's men in the household, we have to make sure that we don't abuse that position of trust. It's a reference she's making. And something that we can take from that aspect with Abraham and Sarah is that a woman's beauty should never be used against her in any circumstance. And that's key. And that's an important takeaway, especially for us men, because we at times, make these kind of excuses, that she was beautiful, as Abraham did. And when we look at most of society's, the break in most of modern society is because men couldn't have self-control. And so it is important from these narratives that as men we seek to protect a woman's dignity and not to use her not to use her beauty against herself or to use it as a way of micromanaging, but just to be truthful men of God who stand firm for the women in our lives. When we point to Genesis chapter 26, 1 to 11, we see a very similar passage one more time. But this time it's not Abraham, it's Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah goes to the same place, and Isaac also lies. That Rebekah is too beautiful, so she's my sister. And the same king takes Rebekah as his wife, and God comes and has to intervene one more time. What does that say about the decisions parents and carers make and the effect it has on their children? The promised child, Isaac, comes into the world and does the same thing his father did twice. And that communicates to us, church, that it's important as parents and carers what we do in the home. Because whatever we do, our children will pick up on it. Am I right? Mm-hmm. He literally comes and he says, Abimelech, Rebekah is my sister. And what Abimelech does, because he's the righteous one in this whole story, he says, you know what, I've experienced something similar years ago. let me hide in the window and let me see how they interact. So he goes and he looks through his window and he just watches Rebekah and Isaac, how they interact, how they are talking. And he realizes actually Rebekah is not his sister. That's very much his partner. And he refrains from making the same mistake twice. But the man of God makes the same mistake twice, and his son comes and repeats the same mistake. And so the takeaway from that is that righteousness looks different at different points in our lives as children of God. Abimelech could have been blamed or thought of as the enemy, but actually he was the righteous one in this story. He was the only one who had integrity and stuck with it. Whereas the promised son of God, Abraham, failed twice, and his son came and did the same thing. And so it is important as children of God not to be so quick to judge the other nations as unrighteous, because you'd be surprised what they possess and what they are actually doing in relation to the God they know and love. Um, this story of 3 times lies and involving women who were silent is very pertinent in our societies today. And how can we as Christians make sure that we are demonstrating to the world that we have a true relationship with God? Well, we can learn from Abraham's experience of being anchored to the God we know and not being quick to almost protect the blessings God has given us. Because really that was Abraham's intention. His intentions were good. He wanted to protect the blessings God had given him in Genesis 12, 1-3, as Alec read. But actually, he did the opposite. He nearly did the opposite and unraveled a whole kind of worms. But God, being so merciful, intervened. And so we see with Abraham, hopefully he learned his lesson. Isaac did the same thing. But we also see the unlikely character of God, being swift to act, because if he doesn't, we ruin everything. That's his hand of justice. But we see his hand of mercy, telling Abraham, look, I'm not going to hold this against you. The promised child is still going to come through. It's going to come through Isaac, and the whole nations will be birthed through this child. In his life, though, we still see him making several mistakes, don't we? We see him going with what Sarah suggested. Well, this time Sarah's voice was very vocal. He says, I need you to lie with Hagar. Do it now. And Abraham listens to the wrong voice again. And he goes and, lays with Hagar. They bring about who? Ishmael. And the promise of God is still working, because God doesn't destroy Hagar. God doesn't destroy Ishmael. He comes in and he intervenes again. He says, look, you've done something else, but I'm not going to destroy them. I'm still going to bless them and make them a great nation. Because my promise stands. When I say something, I don't reverse, I don't retract. I say it and I do it. And so God has to bless Hagar in a special way. God has to bless Ishmael in a special way. And the whole nation is birthed out of that unfortunate situation that happened, of not listening to the voice of God, not waiting on the promises of God. And so our relationship with God may not always be smooth sailing, but where we fall short, God's mercy and graciousness still comes in to deliver us and to save us, and still makes things anew for us. That's always God's desire. When he intends for something to happen and we do something contrary, he still goes around and brings us back to where we need to be. And that's the beauty of the God we serve. He's a God who is justice. He is swift to act, but he's also merciful, swift to forgive. He has almost like his mind transcends us, but his heart is tender and it always reaches out to us. There is always that dual personality with God. And that's what Jesus also wants us to have. He says, I've sent you out as what? You need to be as serpents, right? As wise as serpents, but as what?
Gentle.
Gentle as doves. What does that mean?
Merciful.
Yeah, so we have to be clever. We have to know what we're doing. So while we are building relationships and bridges, we need to know what we're doing. We need to approach it from a cerebral standpoint. We need to know what's going on in the world around us, the dangers. I was actually Googling Folkestone, and I realized that there's a lot of bike thefts here as part of your statistic. And I have a bike. So naturally, I need to know about that, right? I need to know these things so that if I were to ride my bike in Folkestone, I need to make sure that I know what's going on. I lock my bike wherever I go. But then my heart needs to be what? Kind and gentle. As a dove, I shouldn't be so protective of my bike that I want to start a fight. If someone approaches me to take my bike from me, right? That's not the spirit Jesus wants us to have. So we are wise as serpents, but we have a heart so soft and tender as a dove. And that way we can bridge any broken bridges. And we can make friendships, we can establish relationships, and we can continue to walk humbly with God as his children. And so the takeaway from these stories and the reasoning behind them is, I don't want you to leave here having any ill feelings for Abraham. Okay, he was a man who had his own mistakes and faults, but he had a relationship with God. And so God could always come in and save the day, even when he couldn't get it right. When his child came and did the same thing, God was like, you know what, I'm not going to hold it against him. He's learned from his father, I'm going to come in and save the day. And he left Gerar with his wife, Rebecca, and they went and continued to fulfill the promise of God for generations upon generations, of which we are now beneficiaries. And so while we leave this space, we seek to build better relationships with God, even though we are imperfect, and we seek to build relationship with other people around us as well. And God will continue to sustain us, give us the strength to do that, so that our children can also be beneficiaries and learn that, you know what, mom and dad may not always get it right, but they love God. And so we're going to do the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, and so that's what I was trying to get at. And that's really the message of today. Our shortcomings don't define us, but rather it points us to the God who is perfect and who will continue to refine our lives day unto day, week unto week, until we meet Jesus Christ on that final promise day. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah.
Good. And so my prayer to you, Folkestone, is that you continue in your desire to know God, and that you continue to push forward as you're already doing in learning more about God, in knowing more about God, in teaching your children to know more about God, so that whatever happens, God will always direct you back to his arms. And that's the message of today. Amen? So I'm going to leave you now because I felt like I was rattling a bit there.
Amen.
Okay.